There comes a moment when explanation no longer feels natural. You may notice that you no longer feel inclined to describe what you're doing, even to people who are close to you, not because something is being concealed, not because communication has broken down, but because the impulse itself weakens. As you move into 2026, you may find that you no longer feel inclined to describe what you are doing, even to those closest to you. Plans remain unspoken. Direction feels private without becoming secretive. The urge to articulate intentions fades without resistance. In a culture that has grown louder and more performative by 2026, this absence can feel strange. Silence no longer registers as uncertainty. It registers as completion. Explanation has long been embedded in ordinary interaction. People explain themselves constantly, often without realizing it. They explain choices, moods, plans, delays, preferences, and decisions. Explanation functions as a bridge between inner movement and social coherence. When explanation stops functioning, the bridge does not collapse dramatically. It simply becomes unused. The absence of explanation can feel strange because explanation has often served a regulatory role. It reassured others, but more importantly, it reassured the self. By articulating intentions, the individual confirmed direction. By narrating plans, they stabilize identity. Without explanation, that stabilization must occur elsewhere. This is not immediately recognized. The mind searches for familiar reasons. Some assume they have become guarded. Others believe they are withdrawing or losing interest in connection. But guarding implies defense, and withdrawal implies avoidance. What appears here is neither. There is no tension around silence. Silence simply feels adequate. This adequacy is unfamiliar because silence has often been associated with risk. Without explanation, others may misunderstand. Without narration, intentions may be misread. Earlier in development, these risks mattered. Explanation functioned as insurance. It reduced uncertainty. It preempted judgment. It maintained alignment. When the urge to explain dissolves, these concerns lose emotional charge. Misunderstanding no longer feels dangerous. Being misinterpreted does not activate urgency. This does not mean misunderstanding is preferred. It means it is tolerated. Tolerance replaces prevention. Explanation had often been preventative. It aimed to shape perception before perception formed. By explaining oneself, one guided how one would be seen. This guidance required constant effort. Most people underestimate how much energy is spent on preemptive explanation. Even simple actions are often accompanied by internal commentary, how they might be perceived, what assumptions might arise, what clarification might be needed. When the urge to explain fades, this internal commentary quiets. The mind no longer rehearses explanations in advance. It no longer prepares justification for actions that have not yet occurred. This reduction in rehearsal can feel like emptiness at first. The space once occupied by commentary remains unfilled. But emptiness is not what emerges. What emerges is unaccompanied action. Action without narration. This can feel exposed because narration once served as a buffer. By explaining intentions, one softened their impact. One framed actions in acceptable terms. Without narration, action feels bare. Bare action is often mistaken for impulsivity. But impulsivity involves lack of integration. What appears here is integrated action without commentary. The difference is critical. Integrated action does not require explanation because it does not feel internally divided. There is no part of the psyche that needs reassurance. Earlier, explanation often served to reassure an internal audience as much as an external one. By explaining what one was doing, one confirmed to oneself that the action made sense. When explanation fades, it suggests that internal coherence has reached a point where reassurance is no longer required. This does not mean certainty has increased. It means contest has decreased. Contest implies internal disagreement. Explanation functioned as mediation between competing impulses. When contest resolves, mediation becomes unnecessary. The urge to explain is closely linked to the need to be understood. Understanding from others once played a stabilizing role. Being understood confirmed that one's internal experience was valid. When the need to be understood weakens, explanation loses its purpose. This can be unsettling because understanding has often been conflated with connection. People assume that without explanation, connection deteriorates. But explanation is not the same as presence. Presence can exist without narration. In fact, presence often deepens when narration recedes. Without the need to frame experience or others, attention remains closer to the experience itself. This shift is rarely intentional. People do not decide to stop explaining. They simply notice that the impulse is gone. They may still answer questions. They may still clarify when necessary. But the spontaneous urge to volunteer information fades. This fading does not feel like restraint. It feels like completion. Completion of a function. Explanation had served its role. Carl Jung emphasized that as individuation progresses, psychic energy withdraws from external adaptation and reinvests itself internally. Explanation is one of the most common forms of external adaptation. It aligns inner movement with social expectation. When that adaptation is no longer required, explanation loses its regulatory force. This does not produce antisocial behavior. It produces selectivity. Selectivity about what is shared, when and why. Earlier, sharing often occurred preemptively. One explained plans before they were realized. One narrated intentions before they were enacted. This narration created a sense of movement even before movement occurred. When the urge to explain dissolves, movement is no longer preceded by narration. Action comes first. This can feel uncomfortable in environments that expect transparency. Others may interpret silence as withholding, but internally there is no withholding. There is simply no need to translate. Translation implies that inner experience must be converted into socially legible form. When inner coherence strengthens, translation becomes optional. This can create a mismatch between inner state and outer expectation. The individual may still be open, still communicative, but no longer driven to explain themselves into acceptability. Acceptability had once mattered because it secured belonging. Explanation was a tool for maintaining belonging. When belonging no longer depends on explanation, the tool is set aside. This does not mean belonging is rejected. It means belonging is no longer conditional on articulation. This distinction matters because many people equate explanation with honesty. They worry that not explaining is dishonest. But honesty does not require constant disclosure. Honesty requires congruence. Congruence remains intact here. The psyche is not hiding anything from itself. It simply no longer externalizes everything. This externalization had often been excessive. Excessive explanation often arose from anxiety about being misread. When anxiety dissolves, excess falls away. This leaves a quieter form of communication. Communication that occurs when needed, not as a default. This change can be observed in how people talk about their plans. Earlier, plans may have been shared as a way of making them real. By announcing plans, one committed to them socially. This social commitment functioned as motivation. When explanation fades, motivation reorganizes. Plans are no longer made real through announcement. They become real through enactment. This does not make action more forceful. It makes it more contained. Contained action does not leak outward prematurely. Premature explanation often diluted action. By talking about plans, one dispersed energy. By narrating intentions, one replaced doing with saying. When the urge to explain dissolves, this substitution is no longer available. Action must stand on its own. This can slow things down initially. Without the energizing effect of social acknowledgement, momentum may change quality. But this change is not loss. It is recalibration. Recalibration from externally reinforced movement to internally sustained movement. This internal sustenance does not feel dramatic. It does not generate excitement. It produces steadiness. Steadiness is often undervalued because it lacks visible markers. But steadiness does not require narration. Another effect of explanation withdrawal is a shift in how vulnerability is experienced. Earlier, explanation may have been used to manage vulnerability. By explaining oneself, one controlled how vulnerability was perceived. Without explanation, vulnerability is not managed in the same way. This does not mean vulnerability increases. It becomes less performative. Performative vulnerability relies on narration. It explains feelings in advance. It frames exposure. Without the urge to explain, exposure is less curated. This can feel risky, but internally it is not experienced as danger. There is no sense of being unprotected. Protection is no longer sought through explanation. Protection comes from coherence. This coherence reduces the need to justify oneself. Justification had been a defense against misunderstanding. Without fear of misunderstanding, justification loses purpose. The psyche becomes less defensive overall. Defense had been triggered by the possibility of being judged incorrectly. Without that threat, defensive explanation subsides. This does not make one passive. It makes one less reactive. Reactivity had often been verbal. One reacted by explaining, clarifying, correcting. Without that reaction, silence occupies the space. This silence is not empty. It holds direction. Direction is no longer announced. It is enacted. This enactment changes how identity feels. Identity becomes less verbal, less dependent on story. Earlier, identity may have been reinforced through explanation. One told oneself who one was by articulating intentions and values. Without explanation, identity is lived rather than narrated. This can feel disorienting because language had been a primary organizing tool. Without it, the psyche relies on behavior to confirm itself. Behavior becomes the primary expression, not as display, but as fact. Facts do not require explanation to exist. This facticity stabilizes identity. Stability does not come from being understood. It comes from being coherent. Coherence does not announce itself. It persists. As the urge to explain dissolves, one may notice that questions from others feel different. Earlier, questions might have triggered long explanations. Now, responses are simpler, not evasive, not minimalistic, proportionate. Proportion replaces elaboration. Elaboration had often been a way to manage perception. Without that need, proportion suffices. This can create friction in relationships that are built on constant sharing. Others may expect more narrative, but internally nothing feels missing. The psyche no longer experiences explanation as necessary to maintain connection. Connection can exist without constant articulation. This realization is not conceptual. It is felt through repeated moments where silence feels adequate. Adequacy here is key. Silence does not feel lacking. It does not feel tense. It does not feel like avoidance. It feels complete. Completion is not closure. It does not finalize anything. It simply does not ask for addition. Explanation had been an addition. When the need for that addition dissolves, experience remains whole without it. This wholeness is quiet. It does not seek recognition. It does not demand to be shared. It remains where it occurs. And that shift, though difficult to describe, becomes evident through the absence of the urge to explain. When the urge to explain weakens, the first reaction is often confusion rather than clarity. Explanation has been so deeply integrated into daily functioning that its absence feels abnormal. People rarely recognize how much of their mental activity has been devoted to justification, not only to others, but to themselves. Justification once served as a stabilizing process. By explaining why something was done, delayed, chosen, or avoided, the psyche confirmed its own legitimacy. Actions were not allowed to stand alone. They were supported by reason, context, and narrative framing. When justification collapses, this support structure disappears. What remains is action without commentary. This can feel risky because justification had acted as a buffer. It softened the impact of choice. It created distance between the self and potential judgment. Without it, action feels exposed. But this exposure is not social. It is internal. The psyche has been accustomed to checking its actions against imagined evaluation. Even in solitude, there was often an internal witness asking, "Does this make sense? Is this acceptable? How will this be understood?" Justification answered these questions in advance. When the urge to justify dissolves, these questions lose urgency. They do not demand answers. They simply fail to arise with the same force. This does not mean discernment disappears. Discernment remains. What disappears is a need to defend discernment. Defense had been necessary when authority was external. Justification functioned as evidence. It demonstrated that a choice was reasonable, aligned, or legitimate. Without external authority, evidence is no longer required in the same way. This shift can be misinterpreted as carelessness. Others may assume that decisions are being made without thought. Internally, the opposite is true. Thought becomes more direct. Without the need to package decisions for acceptance, thinking no longer bends toward persuasion. It orients toward coherence. Coherence does not argue. It either exists or it does not. This is why justification fades. When coherence is present, explanation becomes redundant. The psyche senses alignment internally and no longer needs to translate that alignment into reasons. This translation had been costly. Much mental energy was spent converting inner sense into defensible language. Words were chosen carefully. Motives were framed. Context was provided. When justification is no longer required, this labor stops. The mind becomes quieter, not empty, less burdened. This quiet can initially feel like loss. People may notice that they have fewer thoughts about their own actions. They may worry that they are becoming careless or inattentive. But what has changed is not attention. It is commentary. Commentary had functioned as a layer between impulse and action. It mediated, evaluated, and justified. Without commentary, action becomes simpler. Simplicity here does not mean impulsivity. Impulsivity bypasses integration. What appears here is integrated action without verbalization. This integration can be felt as a sense of inevitability. Actions occur because they are necessary, not because they are justified. Necessity does not explain itself. This creates a different relationship to responsibility. Earlier, responsibility may have been experienced as obligation to explain. One felt responsible not only for what one did, but for how it would be perceived. Without justification, responsibility becomes internal. One is responsible to coherence rather than to appearance. This internal responsibility is quieter. It does not seek recognition. It does not produce anxiety around misinterpretation. It simply persists. Justification also played a role in regulating guilt. When actions conflicted with expectation, justification reduced guilt by providing reasons. It softened internal judgment. Without justification, guilt reorganizes, not by increasing, but by clarifying. Guilt that depended on external expectation loses force. What remains is responsibility to necessity. If something violates internal coherence, discomfort appears. If it does not, guilt does not arise. This makes guilt more precise. Precision replaces diffusion. Earlier, guilt may have been diffused because it was tied to imagined reactions. Without justification, guilt is tied to actual misalignment. This is easier to work with. Another consequence of justification collapse is a change in how conflict is processed. Earlier, disagreement often triggered explanation. One defended choices, clarified intentions, and argued for legitimacy. Without the urge to justify, conflict feels different. One can listen without preparing a defense. One can register disagreement without needing to resolve it through argument. This does not mean passivity. It means that legitimacy is no longer negotiated through discourse. Negotiation requires a shared authority. When authority relocates internally, negotiation loses urgency. The psyche no longer feels compelled to persuade. Persuasion had often been aimed at securing permission. Without the need for permission, persuasion becomes unnecessary. This changes communication patterns. Speech becomes more minimal, not because less is felt, but because less is required to maintain stability. Words are used when they serve function, not when they serve reassurance. This functional use of language can feel abrupt to others. They may expect elaboration that no longer arrives. Internally, there is no sense of withholding. There is simply no surplus explanation. This surplus had once been a form of self-protection. By explaining, one reduced the risk of being misunderstood. Without fear of misunderstanding, protection becomes unnecessary. This does not mean misunderstanding is irrelevant. It means it is no longer threatening. Threat have been amplified by dependence on being understood. Understanding from others once stabilized identity. Without that dependency, misunderstanding loses power. This does not isolate the individual. It frees them from constant self-translation. Self-translation had been exhausting. Translation requires constant awareness of the audience. Without an audience, translation stops. This also changes how motivation operates. Earlier, justification often preceded action. One explained to oneself why something should be done. Motivation was built through narrative. Without justification, motivation reorganizes. Action occurs without preliminary persuasion. The psyche no longer needs to convince itself. This can feel unsettling because persuasion had been familiar. Without it, action feels bare. Bare action does not feel heroic. It feels ordinary. Ordinariness here is not mediocrity. It is lack of inflation. Inflation often came from narrative. By framing actions as meaningful, necessary, or virtuous, one amplified their importance. Without justification, importance becomes inherent rather than asserted. This inherent importance does not need words. This shift can be seen in how people relate to delays and refusals. Earlier, delays required explanation. One justified why something could not be done immediately. Refusals were softened by reasons. Without justification, refusals may be simpler, not harsh, clear. Clarity replaces appeasement. Appeasement had been linked to fear of disapproval. Without fear of disapproval, appeasement loses function. This does not make the individual indifferent to others. It makes them less governed by others' expectations. Expectations no longer dictate explanation. This can initially strain relationships that rely on constant reassurance. Others may feel unsettled by the absence of explanation, but internally, there is no rupture. The psyche feels more contained. Containment here means that experience does not spill outward unnecessarily. Actions and decisions remain close to their source. This containment supports focus. Focus without justification is different from focus driven by willpower. It does not require constant reinforcement. It persists quietly. Justification had also played a role in managing uncertainty. By explaining, one created the illusion of control. Reasons made uncertainty tolerable. Without justification, uncertainty is tolerated directly. This does not mean uncertainty increases. It becomes less dramatized. Dramatization had been fueled by narrative. Without narrative, uncertainty feels smaller. Smaller not in importance, but an emotional footprint. This reduces anxiety. Anxiety often arises from imagined evaluation. Without justification, imagined evaluation loses relevance. The mind spends less time anticipating judgment. Attention returns to present conditions. This return is not intentional. It is a consequence of reduced mental labor. Labor that had been invisible because it was habitual. When justification collapses, this labor stops. The psyche becomes more efficient. Efficiency here does not mean productivity. It means less wasted effort. Effort is applied where it is needed, not where it must be explained. This efficiency supports endurance. One can continue without constant self-convincing. Self-convincing had been a drain. Without it, energy is conserved. This conservation does not feel like restraint. It feels like relief from unnecessary negotiation. Negotiation had been internal as much as external. One negotiated with oneself about why something was acceptable. Without justification, acceptance is internal. Acceptance does not require explanation. This also changes how identity narratives function. Identity had often been maintained through justification. One explained who one was by explaining what one did. Without justification, identity becomes less verbal. Identity is no longer something to be argued. It is something that functions. Function does not explain itself. This functional identity is more stable because it does not rely on agreement. Agreement is fragile. It can be withdrawn. Function persists. Jung described individuation as a process of differentiation from collective standards. Justification often aligns the individual with those standards. By explaining oneself, one demonstrates conformity or reasonableness. When individuation deepens, This alignment is no longer required. The psyche stops presenting itself for evaluation. This does not mean rejection of the collective. It means independence from its validation. This independence is not loud. It is quiet, quiet enough to be missed by others. But internally it is unmistakable. Because without justification, the psyche feels less strained, less defensive, less reactive, less divided. Division had been created by the need to maintain coherence externally. Without that requirement, internal coherence strengthens. Strengthening here does not feel like power. It feels like absence of conflict. Conflict had been sustained by negotiation. Without negotiation, conflict dissolves. This does not eliminate complexity. Complexity remains, but it is no longer argued into place. Complexity is held. Holding does not require explanation. This holding is the structural change occurring here. The psyche learns that it does not need to justify itself to function. Function becomes its own legitimacy. And once legitimacy no longer depends on explanation, silence becomes sufficient. When explanation and justification lose their authority, life does not become chaotic. It becomes quieter. This quiet is not immediately recognizable as change. There is no clear signal that something fundamental has shifted. Daily routines may continue unchanged. Conversations still occur. Responsibilities remain. What changes is how experience is carried internally. Without the urge to explain, actions no longer arrive with commentary. Choices are made without being translated into reasons. Silence no longer feels like an absence that must be corrected. This alters how the psyche experiences itself. Earlier, narration functioned as a stabilizing structure. By explaining what one was doing, one maintained a sense of continuity. Narration stitched moments together into a coherent story. It reassured the self that movement had direction and meaning. When narration dissolves, continuity is no longer maintained through story. It is maintained through presence. Presence here does not refer to attentiveness or mindfulness. It refers to the fact that experience no longer requires verbal reinforcement to feel real. Reality does not need to be narrated. This is difficult to accept at first because narration has been so central to identity. People often confuse their story with themselves. They believe that without explanation, identity dissolves. But identity does not disappear. It reorganizes. Identity stops being something that must be spoken into existence. It becomes something that functions without commentary. This functional identity feels different. It is less dramatic, less articulate, less concerned with being understood. But it is also more stable. Stability does not come from having a clear narrative. It comes from internal coherence. Coherence does not require words. This shift can be observed in how people relate to their own thoughts. Earlier, thought may have been organized narratively. One thought about oneself in sentences, explanations, and justifications. Without narration, thought becomes more fragmentary but also more direct. It does not need to resolve itself into a story. This does not create confusion. It reduces the pressure to make sense of everything immediately. Sense-making becomes optional. Experience can exist without being explained. This changes how emotion is processed. Earlier, emotion was often narrated internally. Feelings were explained, contextualized, and interpreted as they arose. Without narration, emotion is allowed to exist without commentary. It is felt, registered, and then moves on. This does not make emotion fleeting. It makes it proportional. Narration often amplified emotion by repeatedly revisiting it through explanation. Without narration, emotion is less likely to loop. Loops dissolve. This reduces rumination. Rumination had often been narrative-driven. One revisited experiences by explaining them again and again. Without narration, revisiting loses its structure. The mind no longer circles as much. This does not mean reflection disappears. Reflection becomes less verbal. Reflection shifts from explanation to observation. Observation does not seek resolution. This can feel unfamiliar because explanation has been equated with understanding. People assume that if they are not explaining, they are not understanding. But understanding does not require narration. Understanding can be structural. Structural understanding is felt rather than articulated. This type of understanding stabilizes behavior without producing commentary. The absence of narration also affects how people relate to their past. Earlier, the past may have been organized into a story that explained who one was. Experiences were linked together to form identity. Without narration, the past loses its explanatory role. Memories remain, but they are not constantly recruited to justify present identity. This reduces the need to maintain consistency with earlier versions of oneself. Consistency had been enforced through narrative. Without narrative, identity becomes more flexible. Flexibility here does not mean instability. It means freedom from having to explain continuity. One does not need to justify why one has changed. Change does not require explanation. This can feel unsettling in social contexts where consistency is valued. Others may expect explanations for shifts in behavior or priorities. Internally, there is no explanation to give. The change feels self-evident. This self-evidence is not arrogance. It is absence of doubt. Doubt had been generated by the need to convince. Without the need to convince, doubt weakens. This does not produce certainty. It produces acceptance of ambiguity. Ambiguity no longer feels threatening because it does not need to be resolved through narrative. Life can proceed without full articulation. This alters how plans are experienced. Earlier, plans may have been stabilized by narration. By talking about plans, one made them real. Without narration, plans remain provisional. This does not weaken commitment. It reduces premature fixation. Premature fixation often occurred through explanation. By explaining plans, one committed to a version of the future that might not yet be aligned. Without explanation, plans can evolve quietly. Evolution does not require announcement. This flexibility allows for adjustment without self-betrayal. Earlier, changing direction may have felt like inconsistency because it contradicted a stated narrative. Without narration, direction can change without conflict. Conflict had arisen from having to reconcile behavior with previous explanations. Without explanations, reconciliation is unnecessary. This reduces internal friction. Friction had often been caused by having to live up to what was said. Without the pressure of what was said, one lives according to what is. This also affects how people relate to responsibility. Responsibility no longer includes maintaining a narrative. One is responsible for actions, not for explaining them. This simplifies responsibility. Simplification does not mean irresponsibility. It means less burden. The burden of explanation had been heavy. Explaining required constant awareness of others' perspectives. Without explanation, attention returns to immediate conditions. Immediate conditions become primary. This shift changes how people respond to interruption. Earlier, interruption might have required explanation. One justified why something was interrupted or delayed. Without narration, interruption is handled directly. Directness replaces justification. Directness here is not bluntness. It is lack of embellishment. Embellishment had served to soften perception. Without fear of perception, embellishment loses purpose. This can create a sense of bluntness externally, but internally it feels neutral. Neutrality is often misread as coldness, but coldness implies lack of engagement. What appears here is engagement without performance. Performance had relied on narration. Without narration, interaction becomes more factual. Facts are not less human. They are simply not dramatized. This factual quality extends to how people talk about themselves. Self-description becomes minimal, not because there is nothing to say, but because saying no longer stabilizes identity. Identity does not require description. This can feel like losing language, but it is actually losing dependency on language. Language remains available. It is simply no longer required for coherence. This independence from language changes how the psyche experiences silence. Silence is no longer a gap between explanations. It becomes a medium in which experience exists without commentary. This silence does not feel empty. It feels sufficient. Sufficiency here does not imply satisfaction. It implies adequacy. Adequacy does not ask for more. This is a profound change. Much of human activity is driven by the sense that something is missing and must be explained, filled, or completed. Narration often attempted to fill perceived gaps. Without narration, the psyche recognizes that not every gap requires filling. Some gaps are simply spaces. This recognition reduces compulsion. Compulsion had often been tied to need to make sense of everything verbally. Without that need, compulsion weakens. This does not eliminate effort. It eliminates unnecessary effort. Effort becomes precise. Precision is not efficiency in the productivity sense. It is appropriateness. Action is taken when needed, not when it must be justified. This creates a different rhythm of life, a rhythm less oriented toward explanation and more toward responsiveness. Responsiveness here means responding to reality rather than to narrative. Narrative had often distorted reality by imposing meaning prematurely. Without narration, meaning emerges more slowly. Slow meaning is more stable. It does not require reinforcement. This stability affects how people experience uncertainty. Uncertainty no longer triggers immediate explanation. One does not rush to define or label experience. Experience is allowed to remain undefined. This tolerance for undefined experience is rare. It signals a shift in authority. Authority is no longer derived from making sense of things verbally. It comes from staying with what is. Staying does not require explanation. This staying can feel like standing still, but it is not stagnation. It is containment. Containment allows movement to arise naturally. Movement that arises without narration is less forced. Force had often come from the need to justify. Without justification, movement is quieter but more durable. Durability here refers to sustainability. One can continue without exhausting oneself through constant self-explanation. This endurance is not heroic. It is ordinary. Ordinary endurance is often overlooked because it lacks drama, but drama had been sustained by narration. Without narration, life loses some of its drama. What remains is not emptiness. It is continuity. Continuity without explanation. And that continuity does not ask to be turned into a story. When explanation falls away, nothing essential disappears. What disappears is a need to translate experience into legitimacy. Life continues without narration. Action continues without justification. Identity continues without description. Take this as essential learning as you move into 2026. What remains is coherence that does not need to be spoken. Experience holds its own weight. If this way of describing silence and unspoken movement feels familiar, you can subscribe to the Inner Shadow Signal to stay with these reflections. And if someone you know is moving through a similar withdrawal from explanation, sharing this video at this moment of the new year may help them recognize it without being told what to do. You're also welcome to leave a comment if you've noticed how life changes when you stop explaining yourself, even in small ways.